Hi everyone, my name is Isabel Harrison. I'm a senior at U of A studying chemistry in the Chemistry and Biochemistry department. I'm also president of the Chemistry Club, also known as SMACS Arizona. So we put together this little presentation about research, scholarships, and basically how to succeed, everything that we wish we would have been told coming in. So SMACS Arizona presents How to Be in College and Make Money Doing It. The first thing I wanted to talk about is scholarships available in CBC and at U Arizona. First off, there's tons available, especially through CBC. So what I have here is a list of all of the CBC awards and scholarships throughout the year, as well as the link to that page so you can click on each one and find out more. A good person to have on your side is Olivia Mendoza. So Olivia is the senior program coordinator for CBC. She sends out emails every so often that include new scholarships, different required materials for them, and reminders of when they're due. So always make sure to read her emails. They're very, very informative when it comes to CBC and the scholarships available. If you want to look outside of CBC, Scholarship Universe is a great place to start. Scholarship Universe is a University of Arizona resource that asks you questions to get scholarships catered to you and your college. So there's a bunch of different outside sources of scholarships, college scholarships specific to what college you're in, and then U of A scholarships all in one place, and it's very, very user-friendly. What I have here on the slide is just a picture of the dashboard, so you can get a little bit familiar with it before you log on. A good thing to note about scholarships is that you should apply to as many as possible. The more you apply for, the more you will get. I know personally a lot of CBC scholarships get overlooked. I've received 2 from CBC where I was actually the only person to apply. So make sure you definitely look at those. Any that you qualify for, you should definitely spend the time to apply to. One thing you want to note is that when you're applying to different scholarships, you need to spend time with your resume and CV for each different one. So it's a lot like a job in that way. You need to cater to whoever is reading your resume, and you want to make sure that your resume embodies who you are presenting yourself to be for the scholarship that you're applying for. A lot of these scholarships require letters of recommendation. Make sure you ask for those early. I know personally it would be terrible to be asked for a letter of recommendation in 24 hours before it was due. Most professors like 2 to 3 weeks. So people you can ask professors that you got to know in office hours. You can ask your PIs, bosses, TAs, or anyone that you have worked with personally that can speak to your character or what you're doing in CBC. When you ask for your letters of recommendation, you want to make sure that you send your resume and any relevant application material along with it, just so whoever is writing your letter can get to know you a little bit more and write a more specific letter for what you're applying for. One thing that will definitely make asking for letters of recommendation easier is to make friends with the department staff. So getting the same letter over and over again from one professor that you had for one semester can get a little tedious, and it's something that you'd like to avoid. So the best way to do this is to go to office hours. Even if it's just to introduce yourself to your professor or TA, it makes you more memorable as a student. So a lot of times students won't go to office hours until a day before the exam, and everybody kind of gets grouped together. But if you're there constantly, or at least at the beginning of the semester, once or twice, your professor or TA will remember who you are. So you can bring in old exams, homeworks, reading questions, anything that you could have a question on, go ahead and bring it. It will get you help in your class, and your professor will know your name. Second thing is, if you're in the chemistry club, go ahead and put it on your resume. So we haven't done much outreach yet this year, but we're pretty well known in CBC, and a lot of different people like us. So if you're in the chemistry club, put it on your resume. Make sure that whoever you're applying for their scholarship knows who you are and what you like to do. And then this isn't as specific to chemistry club, but just in general, on a resume, consistency is key. All right, and one other thing that would definitely help is to get into research if you want to. So there isn't anything stopping you from getting into a research lab, but also you don't have to do research. I didn't, it's not really for me, but there shouldn't be anything stopping you from doing it if you want to. Making friends with your PI is also a really, really great way to get recommendations for scholarships, grad schools, and for jobs in the future. So your PI would be someone that you're working very closely with. They'll get to know you and kind of what you want to do, and so they'll be able to cater their recommendations for that. Then, how do you get into research? So Christian is going to go ahead and give the next part and talk a little bit about his research experience and how he got into his lab.
Sweet. So as Isabel said, research experience isn't required in your undergraduate experience, but I find it to be really helpful in narrowing down like what I want to do post-graduation. So first, just a few acknowledgements. First, Dr. Buntsman. He was massively influential in just mentoring me in the early stages of looking for a lab. He gave me advice on what it meant to be a researcher. And he also asked me tough questions that forced me to think about why I wanted to do research, as well as also acknowledging some of the less appealing aspects of research. Dr. Khadija Al-Najjar. She's the postdoc that I directly work with in Dr. Sweezy's lab, and she's shown me basically everything that I know. She seemingly has infinite patience. People like her make undergraduate experience possible. Dr. Sweezy, she's the PI of the lab, and has made every meeting that I've had with her personal and genuine. It's pretty daunting talking to a PI, but she has the ability to just break down the most complex concepts into something like myself, an inexperienced researcher, can understand and get excited about. And she's also just moved everything out of my way basically to give me the best opportunities possible while in her lab. And last but not least, Dr. Thacker. She teaches Biochemistry 296B, which is a class that I'll get into briefly later on. But even though I've only had her class for a semester, her class directly aided in my growth as a researcher. She showed me like basics of a researcher that are just kind of expected sometimes, of like how to read a research paper. It's not like reading a novel, and it takes a little bit of practice. And her class, among other things, like goes over different techniques, just to set like the absolute basics and just set a good foundation going forward. So who am I first, and why should you care? Well, I'm a biochemistry sophomore, so I can't speak from a senior's perspective of doing 4 years of research. But the experience of first getting into a lab is pretty fresh in my mind. So I'm a current research assistant in Dr. Sweezy's lab at the U of A Cancer Center. And right now I'm studying how OGG1 and polymerase beta, two different proteins that contribute to different kinds of cancer, mutate via oxidative damage and how they connect to said cancer. So I just want to start off with this quote from Dr. Buntsman from a conversation we had when I was first just looking for a PI and just talking to different PIs and seeing what research was all about, right? And he told me that persistence is the most important skill, bar none. Where he was saying that even if someone was smarter or more qualified, that someone that is persistent will outwork them, that the harder worker will always be better off. He also said that persistence is really the only human personality characteristic that reliably leads to accomplishing things. That even if you're the smartest person around, if you're not persistent, you won't finish your project and you won't have a paper. You won't have that impact that comes with it. So just keep that in mind. I thought that was pretty powerful. So where do you even find a PI to talk to even have the door open? A good spot to start is this website that I have up. That's ur.arizona.edu. That's just undergraduate research and the U of A page for it. And there's a tab there, search UA researchers. This section of the website, for example, allows you to say, hey, find me researchers in the College of Science and chemistry and biochemistry that have paid positions. And it'll spit out a whole list of different PIs that fulfill those like criteria. So I also just want to touch on different types of compensation, so to speak. The three main ones are credits, for credit, paid positions, and volunteering positions. So for credits is basically You do some like documentation at the beginning, just with the CBC, the chemistry biochemistry department, and your PI, basically saying by the end of this term, so say a semester, you'll earn X amount of credits towards your program, and the details of how many credits and how long, bring that up with an advisor. Next is paid. So you fulfill X amount of hours and you get paid a wage that you discuss with your PI. And volunteering is just volunteering. You show up on your own time. You still have expectations of that you'll be getting things done, and still you still have the expectation of being professional even though you're not paid. But also just want to point out that volunteering in a lab is not necessarily a bad idea, that it's automatically worse than a paid position. Right now in Dr. Sweezy's lab, I'm a volunteer. I've been volunteering for the past year. And my reason for doing that is the greater flexibility that comes from it. When you have a paid position, you have to fulfill a certain amount of hours to be a paid employee, essentially. But with volunteering, it gives you a lot more flexibility. And that flexibility I use when, let's say I have an exam that's coming up that I'm really stressed out about, and I just need more time to study for it. I can talk to my postdoc that I work with and the PI and say, hey, I can't make it this Thursday, let's say, but I'll be back like next week like normal. I just need to make sure I get enough time to study for this exam. Cool. And that's not to say that if you have if you're in a lab for credits or in a paid position, that the PI or postdoc that you work with or grad student won't give you that flexibility. It just gives you a little bit more flexibility. Another important detail that this table gives you, the search result gives you, is the research area, what the PI is studying. And this is pretty important. This is not something to cast aside. This should be one of the first things that you look at. So read into it, because if you want to work in a PI's lab, you should be at least interested in what they're doing. I firmly am against the idea of just getting into any research lab for the sake of having it as a resume point. Getting research experience can be a really powerful experience, even if you don't intend to be a career researcher. It can give you skills and experiences that can extend beyond just the specific field that you're looking at. And once you do narrow down a research area that is interesting to you and that has PIs that are looking for undergraduate students, reach out to them, send them an email, and I highly recommend trying to find a time to talk in person. I know now that recommendation is not a good idea necessarily, just because of COVID. So a Zoom call works just fine. But once COVID is a thing of the past, highly recommend an in-person conversation. And I guess I just want to emphasize the point again that persistence is key. PIs are busy. These are examples of email threads with Dr. Buntsman and Dr. Sweezy before I met up and had a conversation with them last year, where these were emails just trying to find time to meet up and have a conversation about potentially being in their lab. So let's say you scheduled a meeting for your PI, it's next week, and you don't know what to expect, and you don't know how to prepare. So first thing I'd recommend is to show up early. If it's an in-person meeting, it'll give you time to find their room, and I don't know what it is about some buildings on campus. Some of the rooms are like within a labyrinth. It basically took me, when I was meeting up with Dr. Sweezy, it took me sending her an email on my phone saying, please come and fetch me from the hallway. I cannot find your room. And if it's a Zoom meeting, Zoom is sometimes unreliable. That happened to me when I was joining a lab meeting in Dr. Sweezy's lab. My Zoom for all of my classes for the past, however many months was working perfectly fine. But of course, the day that I needed to be at this meeting, it crashed and burned and just decided to have issues. And beyond that, it also gives a good first impression. If you're super late, it makes it look like you don't really care about it. Next up, just read what they're studying and consider having a few questions prepared. From my experience, it doesn't look very good if you show up and ask the question of, so what do you study? So I would highly recommend reading what projects the PI has worked on in the past, different papers that the lab group as a whole has produced, what they're working on now, what they want to work on in the future. You don't have to have all of those questions answered, but the more you look into it, the better. Another thing I suggest is to take notes. PIs are very smart and use a lot of technical terms just because they are specific terms that describe what they're talking about. But it can be pretty overwhelming having these detailed conversations about their research and what research you could potentially be working on. So it becomes easy to forget some details. So just taking notes helps you remember a week, maybe even a day later, of what you even talked about and what opportunities might be available for you in that lab. And as a side note, it also looks good taking notes. Like, it makes it look like you care and are very studious. I think it's more of a side note than anything else, but just I recommend drinking a little bit of water before. Having a dry mouth sucks when you're talking for a long time, so it just makes it more comfortable. So one of the main things that I took away from the conversation from Dr. Buntsman were the 3 pillars of picking a lab. So the first of which is time. How much time does the PI have to mentor you? How many graduate and undergraduates do they have to divide their time with? A large lab with lots of different, with a lot of undergraduates and postdocs, they may have a lot of knowledge there that you can learn from, right? You learn from different people working with different people. But because of that, the PI has to split their time up. So they might not have as much time to directly mentor you, which is potentially fine if you find yourself to be an independent worker that seems to be going like a groove working at the lab. But if you're anything like in my experience, I walked in with no experience at all and I needed a lot of direction. So that kind of environment wouldn't work for me. The second pillar is just knowledge. Do you think you'll learn something from being in the lab? Does the PI seem knowledgeable? And are they willing to share that knowledge? So I would argue one of the biggest reasons for joining a research lab is to learn some really real world applications of science. It's one thing to learn things in a classroom in organic chemistry, general chemistry, etc. But I found that a research lab is where these different topics that you learn in the classroom merge together and come into play in a more complex way. And you sometimes need other people's knowledge and experience to help you understand what you're even looking at. And that relies on them being able to, being willing to share their knowledge and experience. For example, I've heard some horror stories of different labs at different universities that keep their undergraduates kind of in the dark of what they're working on. Basically, follow these directions to run this gel or do this experiment, and they're not really given the big picture of what they're working on. And last but definitely not least is funding. Is the lab well funded? You don't want the lab to shut down after 2 weeks of working there, because funding is basically the lifeblood that keeps research alive. Research is expensive and it relies on adequate funding. So beyond just a longevity piece of what funding contributes to, funding also contributes to what kind of machines, what kind of tools and techniques would be available to the lab. And I definitely want to emphasize that all of these pillars are important, but most labs are lacking in one area. So on the last point of funding, how do I check their funding? This website, projectreporter.nih, is a website with a search function that allows you to look up different PIs and their groups to see what kind of grants they've been awarded. Since labs are funded by grants, which are mostly provided by the US government, this means that this information is public, so anyone can look this up. So this can be a really good tool to start to decide whether the lab is well funded and if that's something that will affect your potential lab experience in that group. Another big thing that I want to be sure to mention is research papers, literature. They can be super daunting. This screenshot right here is from one of the papers that I'm reading currently for Dr. Sweezy's lab, that as I was skimming through, this is like towards the end, this table made me really nervous of what I was about to read because I didn't know anything of what it was talking about. I was looking through all the values and the terms and the K values. I'm like, okay, there's something with kinetics, but beyond that, I'm not really sure what's going on. But after taking some time, it became more digestible. So research papers are scary. So one of the ways that can help with this, just getting you essentially a foot in the door, so to speak, is Biochemistry 296B that I mentioned earlier. It's a class that is basically completely dedicated to teaching you how to read research papers, how to interpret them, how to answer questions about them, and just how to think about them critically. It's a 1-credit class, but definitely talk to your advisor and see if this is an option for you. Another thing is journal clubs. Many labs like Dr. Sweezy's lab, for example, that I'm in, host internal meetings where papers important to the group's research are discussed. Journal clubs are also run by outside groups too. For example, the American Chemical Society runs journal clubs every once in a while in specific groups talking about different papers. So I would highly recommend attending these journal clubs if possible. Another thing to consider when digesting a research paper and digesting literature is reading what you need. Most papers are filled with jargon and just detail that makes it difficult to understand from a first glance. It doesn't mean that reading these descriptions of the methods and data are useless because they're so detailed, but it might not be as helpful as the abstract or introduction. And just personally, printing the papers help. I print them out and then with different colored pens and highlighters make a bunch of annotations on them, and it also helps me keep a little bit more focused. If I read papers on my laptop, let's say, I might get more distracted. So now I'm saying if you don't need to read the whole research paper, how do you determine what do you need to read? So this slide is from a screenshot from Dr. Thacker that she used in her Biochemistry 296B course, which starts to narrow down the answer to that question. So if you just want a big picture, for example, before you're having a meeting with your PI and you can't comb through all the methods and data beforehand, but you at least want to get a big picture going, the title and abstract, I would argue the introduction are crucial. If you're looking just for theory, the literature review, for example, would be a place to go. And if you're looking for the implications of why does this research matter, the abstract and the discussion and conclusion would be helpful sections to look at. And then how do you even find a paper? You want to find some information, some literature to prepare for a meeting with your PI and just get to know about the field that you're looking at. How do you even find them? SciFinder, which you can find the link to the website via the U of A library database link. As U of A students, we have automatic access to this database, and it contains a lot of research papers from a lot of different journals, so there's a wide range of information available. So you can search for a topic and just refine based off of different parameters that you're looking for. Another resource available is Google Scholar. It's a little bit less reliable and can show papers that you don't have access to through the U of A. It is still a good resource to consider. Pro tip, use the U of A Wi-Fi or VPN. There's some instructions on the U of A website if you have trouble installing them. What this essentially allows you to do is to include the licenses that you gain. It includes the licenses that you already pay for through your tuition from the U of A to apply to your search results. And to touch on again, read abstracts first. They're just a short section at the beginning that serve as a really important outline to the who, what, why, where, when, results, etc. of the paper and the experiment. Another thing I would recommend that's not listed on the slide, let's say you're already in a research lab but you're still early or just have more questions or want to get more information, I would ask your PI or grad student or whoever you work directly with of some papers that they feel would help in your understanding of the project. In my case, I asked Dr. Khadija Al-Najjar and Dr. Sweezy both for some research papers to read for the projects, and they both sent me basically an entire library of papers to read. So typically what the problem ends up becoming is too many papers and not enough time rather than the opposite. But it's good to have that abundance. Just another thing that I want to emphasize is to work to find a balance with your lab time. Every PI that I've personally had a conversation with emphasize the importance of your academics, of your classes. It can be really easy to allow research to take up a lot of time since research is very dynamic. But it becomes really important for you to grow the ability to know when you need to carve some time to study and when you carve time to do research. Because in my experience, your research helps your understanding of courses, and your courses help your understanding of the research. So they work hand in hand, and though they can both be high on your priority list, I would have your courses take the top priority. And I'd encourage you to send any questions you might have either to my email, which is on the slide, or the chemistry club email that's on the slide. We'd be more than happy to answer any questions and just give our 2 cents. And also talk to your advisors and other undergraduates that you know that are in research and ask for their experiences, as those experiences can also be really helpful. So thank you, and best of luck finding a research lab.